Welcome to Liberty TV, setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men. From the studios of Access TV in Salina, Kansas, I'm your host, D.C. Hanna. Thanks for joining us on this edition of Liberty TV. This season on Liberty TV, we're talking about economic liberty. This month, we'll compare two economic theories from two opposing theorists, Adam Smith and Karl Marx. Adam Smith described the theory of the free market in his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. Smith believed that by pursuing his own self-interest, each man indirectly promotes the good of society. Competition in a free market would keep prices low while building an incentive for more and more varied goods and services. Smith referred to this effect on an economy or society as an invisible hand. He wrote, "It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessity, but of their advantages." To Adam Smith, an economy was a collection of individuals, each peacefully pursuing his own self-interest by manufacturing, buying, selling, and using goods, or providing or purchasing services. Each transaction is voluntary and beneficial. Adam Smith's theory of mutually beneficial trade was rejected by Karl Marx, who wrote Das Kapital in 1867. To Marx, society and economy was a struggle between wealthy property owners and a poor working underclass. The owner profited from his investment of property or capital at the expense of the underclass, which invested labor. In the following video, the differences will be explained further.
Adam Smith versus Karl Marx. This could quickly turn into a debate between the ideas of capitalism and the ideas of socialism, or the ideas of capitalism and the radical version of socialism, Marxism, or it even could turn into a debate between capitalism and communism, which derived from Marxism. Although these philosophers varied greatly in their ideas and philosophies, without them the Industrial Revolution would not have been what it is, and it would not have the effect today without them. Adam Smith. Adam Smith was born on June 17, 1723 in Scotland. He was a professor at the University of Glasgow, and he wrote the book, The Wealth of Nations. In this book, he defended the ideas of a free market, free economy, and the three natural laws. Smith was a firm believer in laissez-faire economics, and he also thought that economic liberty would result in economic progress. At the core of Adam Smith's laissez-faire capitalist philosophies lies the three natural laws of economics. Law 1 is the law of self-interest. Law number 2 is the law of competition. And law number 3 is the law of supply and demand. Law number 1 of Smith's natural laws is the law of self-interest. This question is asked almost every day by most people around the world. The question is, why work? Why spend 8 to 12 hours every day working? The answer for most people is you or your family. Why do you go to school? To get an education, which will most likely lead to a better life, with more money, more food, and more luxuries such as vacations, electronics, and a better house for you and your family. Law number 2 of Smith's natural laws is the law of competition. A small family-owned shop opens up on a street with some other surrounding small shops around it. Unlike the other shops, this one sells dressers. We will call this store number 1. Store 1 has one worker, and they can make one dresser in the average of 3 months. So in January, a customer comes and takes away the dresser. Another customer comes and they order another dresser. And in April, the customer comes back and takes their dresser that they ordered. Business is going great for store number 1. However, in May, another store selling the same dressers opens up just down the street. We will call this store number 2. In In July, store number 2 releases a dresser while store number 1 is still out of stock. Store number 2 continues to make dressers, and instead of waiting, one customer comes and takes them all at once. This causes store number 1 to make a better product. This causes store number 2 to make a better product, and they keep enhancing their products as the need for business increases. This turns into something like a game for the businesses. One store releases a product, the next store tops that, and the next store tops that. The more businesses there are, the more competition is created. Ultimately, this competition creates a better product. Law number 3 of Smith's natural laws is the law of supply and demand. The economy always has and always will be dependent on supply and demand. A dresser factory will always sell dressers, but it will be dependent on the supply and demand on how it will sell with the public. Supply meaning how many could be made with the resources that they have, and demand meaning the popularity that this product has in public. If the supply is low and the demand is low, the cost will stay constant, meaning no fluctuations, and it will cost to make the product, but not many will be made. When the supply is low and the demand is high, it will cost to make the product, and it will be very expensive to buy it. When the supply is high and the demand is low, it will cost little to make the product, and it will not be expensive to buy. When the supply happens to be high and the demand happens to be high, this is where Smith's third law takes action. Smith believed that enough goods would be made at a low price in order to keep up with the high demand. When the supply was high and the demand was high, this caused the economy to rise, and it makes money. A dresser factory can only make one dresser per every day. However, the demand for these dressers becomes very high in a short period of time. This relatively slow rate causes the public to be angry with the factory because they want more dressers. However, the factory can only make so many at a time. This causes the factory to change their ways, so the 1 per day quota is now turned into a dresser every hour. At the basis of all Adam Smith's beliefs lies a strong belief in laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire basically means to have the government leave you alone. They thought that the nations did not grow wealthy from tariffs. Rather, free trade caused nations to grow wealthy. Free trade is trade with no regulation and no government interaction. They thought that free trade would boost the economy and would make a lot of money. A combination of Smith, Malthus, and Ricardo created a new way of thinking called capitalism. This new way of thinking thought that companies should be private and that the sole reason to invest money was to create profits. Thomas Malthus thought that the population was increasing at a faster rate than the actual food supply was. He also thought that people will always be poor if once poor. David Ricardo also thought that once you are poor, you will always be poor. He also thought that if there was a high number of workers and a high number of resources, the product will be cheap. However, if there's a low number of workers and a low number of resources, it will be expensive. Karl Marx was born May 5, 1818 in Germany. Coming from him came the philosophy of Marxism, which was really just a more radical version of socialism. In his book, The Communist Manifesto, he expressed his thoughts in the problems that he saw in the capitalist system. In his book, he discussed the problems with permanent social classes, and he also discussed how the poor will suffer because they will always be poor. He thought that human society always has been and always will be derived of social classes, and that these social classes will be permanent. He thought that once poor, you will always be poor. In the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx explained his views on social classes. He thought that social classes are permanent. Before the Industrial Revolution, he had workers on the bottom, the bourgeoisie or the middle class in the middle, and then wealthy on top. After the Industrial Revolution, he thought that the workers were going to be on the bottom, the middle class in the middle, and wealthy on the top. However, he had a gap between the wealthy and the rest. He thought that the wealthy were going to grow even wealthier, and that the poor were going to grow even poorer. With the distribution of money with extremely wealthy on the right and extremely poor on the left. Before the Industrial Revolution, Marx thought that the wealthy, the middle class, and the poor were relatively close to one another based on the distribution of wealth. However, after the Industrial Revolution, he thought that the wealthy would grow extremely wealthy, the poor would grow extremely poor, and the middle class would lose some of their wealth as well. The poor worked in terrible conditions, and Marx thought that this would cause the poor, which was the majority of the population, to overthrow the factories. How Marx saw the future. Marx thought that the capitalist system was going to destroy itself. He thought that the factories were going to end up competing against the small family-owned businesses. While a small family-owned business can make one dresser, in the same time, a factory can make many different dressers of many different designs. Marx thought that this would completely destroy all family-owned businesses. He thought that all of the artisans would disappear. Marx thought that the wealth was going to be held in factories and manufacturers. He thought that because of this, the people would revolt. People would want their money, their power, and their equality back. He thought that because of this, everything would be shared, everyone shared, and everyone's profits would share. This would cause complete equality. The government would be held in the people. This new society would now become social class free. Marx described this point as a state of communism. Marx's stage of pure communism. Marx considered this stage the last phase in turning the society into complete socialism. In this phase, everything is owned by the people. Private property would cease to exist. All land would become owned by the people. All factory, mines, railroads, and businesses would also become owned by the people. All food and goods would become shared equally among all. There were very few immediate reactions to Marx's The Communist Manifesto. However, by the turn of the century, Marx's ideas of communism had spread all the way around the world. Marx's ideas of communism caused explosive results worldwide. His ideas affected many countries, including Russia's Lenin, China's Mao Zedong, and Cuba's Fidel Castro. Were Marx's predictions right or wrong? For the most part, they were wrong. Marx thought that economic forces determined and predicted the outcome of society. Turns out there are many factors, including religion, nationalism, ethnic loyalties, and a desire for democratic reforms. Also, Marx thought that the gap between the rich and poor would grow immensely. The gap actually did not grow because the government had enforced many new reforms that would prevent this from happening. Although the ideas of these philosophers varied greatly, our society would not be what it is without them.
Adam Smith's theory of the free market is based on free will, human nature, while Karl Marx's communism must destroy free will and human nature completely to succeed. Because the only way to destroy man's free will is to destroy the man, Marxism is a utopian philosophy, impossible to implement in the real world. The history of the last 100 years has proven that to be true. Modern socialists make the same mistakes of denying free will, expecting the state to control the market, and ultimately expecting an oppressive state to suppress individualism and human nature. 3 years after the first printing of Das Kapital, the French philosopher Frédéric Bastiat published The Law, a defense of liberty, individualism, and rule of law. To Bastiat, government redistribution of wealth, a central tenet of Marxism, was a perversion of the law, which he called legal plunder, and a false philanthropy which destroys liberty. Bastiat was an early libertarian, and his writings are still used today to argue for personal freedom, personal responsibility, and limited government.
The law perverted, and the police powers of the state perverted along with it. The law, I say, not only turned from its proper purpose, but made to follow an entirely contrary purpose. The law became the weapon of every kind of greed. Instead of checking crime, the law itself guilty of the evils it is supposed to punish. These are words which in 1850, Frédéric Bastiat, a French political philosopher and economist, chose to begin his most famous work, The Law. The key theme of this book is an examination of what happens to a society when the law becomes a weapon of those in power, rather than a tool to protect the rights and freedoms of individuals. While Bastiat was writing over 150 years ago, his words on this important subject continue to be extremely relevant and insightful. To understand how the law can become a weapon of those in power, and the effects that arise when it does, we must first discuss what Bastiat saw as the proper function of law. When discussing the role of law, Bastiat saw it as useful to pose the following question. Since no individual acting separately can lawfully use force to destroy the rights of others, does it not logically follow that the same principle also applies to the common force that is nothing more than the organized combination of the individual forces? In other words, Bastiat believed it to be commonsensical that if an individual is prohibited from committing a certain action because it harms others or their property, then a group of individuals should also be prohibited from committing these same actions. With this idea in mind, Bastiat stated, "If this is true, then nothing can be more evident than this. The law is the organization of the natural right of lawful defense. It is the substitution of a common force for individual forces. And this common force is to do only what the individual forces have a natural and lawful right to do, to protect persons, liberties, and properties, to maintain the right of each, and to cause justice to reign over all." Bastiat put forth what is called a negative conception of law. For him, law was a tool to help prevent certain actions, actions which harmed others or their property. It was not a tool to be used to compel or coerce people to act in a certain way, which is called a positive conception of law. When law and force keep a person within the bounds of justice, they impose nothing but a mere negation. They oblige him only to abstain from harming others. They violate neither his personality, his liberty, nor his property. They safeguard all these. But when the law, by means of its necessary agent, force, imposes upon men a regulation of labor, a method or a subject of education, a religious faith or creed, then the law is no longer negative. It acts positively upon people. These days, as is evidenced by the massive growth of government, politicians are largely in favor of a positive conception of law. This bias was also present in Bastiat's time, and in his book, The Law, Bastiat emphasized the danger that arises when the use of law expands beyond imposing a mere negation. One of the most common and serious dangers is the emergence of what Bastiat called legal plunder. When a portion of wealth, Bastiat wrote, is transferred from the person who owns it, without his consent and without compensation, and whether by force or by fraud, to anyone who does not own it, then I say that property is violated, that an act of plunder is committed. I say that this act is exactly what the law is supposed to suppress, always and everywhere. When the law itself commits this act that it is supposed to suppress, I say that plunder is still committed. According to Bastiat, plunder becomes legalized plunder when it is undertaken by those who control the law. or in other words, when those in government use the power of the police, courts, and jails to involuntarily transfer wealth away from those who have obtained it in a voluntary manner. Bastiat believed that the main motivational factor behind legalized plunder was stupid greed, or in other words, the desire to obtain wealth in the easiest manner possible. In order to survive, humans must consume goods, and to obtain these goods one can either make use of voluntary means, which may include being the recipient of charity, but for most people means performing labor, or one can make use of involuntary means, namely using force, fraud, or coercion to take goods from others. The involuntary means to obtain goods is what Bastiat called plunder. Following from this, Bastiat wrote, "Now since man is naturally inclined to avoid pain, and since labor is pain in itself, it follows that men will resort to plunder whenever plunder is easier than work. History shows this quite clearly. As Bastiat recognized, plunder becomes much easier when permitted by the law. When the plunder is abetted by the law, it does not fear your courts, your police, and your prisons. Rather, it may call upon them for help." Recognizing the danger to society which results from excessive plundering, legal or otherwise, Bastiat maintained that plunder must be made more painful and dangerous than labor. It should not be easier for an individual, corporation, or government employee to grow rich by influencing the law than it is to grow rich in a voluntary manner, that is, by serving the needs of other human beings. But to make plunder more difficult than labor, the law must be restored to its proper function. However, Bastiat was not naive in thinking that such a change to the law would be easy. Often groups who are initially the victims of legalized plunder try to gain power not to put an end to it, but to take part in it. Men naturally rebel against the injustice of which they are victims. Thus, when plunder is organized by law for the profit of those who make the law, all the plundered classes try somehow to enter, by peaceful or revolutionary means, into the making of laws. As legalized plunder becomes increasingly accepted as a suitable and even necessary means to obtain wealth, its nefarious effects are largely forgotten. "The present-day delusion," Bastiat wrote, "is an attempt to enrich everyone at the expense of everyone else, to make plunder universal under the pretense of organizing it." Bastiat recognized that not all legalized plunder was driven by stupid greed, that is, by laziness and the desire to enrich oneself in what is seen as the easiest manner. Rather, there are also people motivated to partake in legalized plunder by what Bastiat called false philanthropy. Those driven by false philanthropy believe legalized plunder to be the best means to alleviate poverty and suffering. When a politician views society from the seclusion of his office, wrote Bastiat, he is struck by the spectacle of inequality that he sees. He deplores the deprivations, which are the lot of so many of our brothers, deprivations which appear to be even sadder when contrasted with luxury and wealth. Perhaps the politician should ask himself whether this state of affairs has not been caused by old conquests and lootings, and by more recent legal plunder. But the politician never gives this a thought. His mind turns to organizations, combinations, and arrangements, legal or apparently legal. He attempts to remedy the evil by increasing and perpetuating the very thing that caused the evil in the first place, legal plunder. While Bastiat deplored what he considered false philanthropy, he was not in any way against helping those in need. Rather, he believed that the alleviation of poverty and the provision of services, such as education, could be done most effectively in a voluntary manner, as he wrote in one passage directed to the socialists of his day, but which applies to anyone who favors massive government intervention in society. Socialism, like the ancient ideas from which it springs, confuses the distinction between government and society. As a result of this, every time we object to a thing being done by government, the socialists conclude that we object to its being done at all. Bastiat continued by writing, "We disapprove of state education, then the socialists say we are opposed to any education. We object to a state religion, then the socialists say that we want no religion at all. We object to a state-enforced equality, then they say that we are against equality, and so on and so on. It is as if the socialists were to accuse us of not wanting persons to eat because we do not want the state to raise grain." This belief that if the government does not provide a certain service, then no one will, is still prevalent today, and helps explain why so many people favor big government. Bastiat suggested that the belief that only governments are capable of providing certain services arises from a perverse view of humanity. a view which maintains that free individuals lack the compassion, concern, and capability to help those in need. And to conclude, we will quote Bastia, who pointed out the absurdity of this belief by posing two questions. If the natural tendencies of mankind are so bad that it is not safe to permit people to be free, how is it that the tendencies of these organizers are always good? If we are free, does it follow that we shall then cease to associate with each other, to help each other, to love and succor our unfortunate brothers, to study the secrets of nature, and to strive to improve ourselves to the best of our abilities?
The law is essential reading for anyone who believes in liberty. This has been Liberty TV, produced in cooperation with the Libertarian Party of Saline County. Tune in next time when we will continue to set brush fires of freedom in the minds of men. I'm DC Hanna. Live free or die.